Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. During the administration of Felipe Calderón, the Mexican government passed ambitious legislation to promote clean energy. The current administration, under López Obrador, has asserted its commitment to the goal set by this legislation of generating 35% of Mexico's power from clean energy. Wind power is expected to account for half of that 35%. Achieving such goals, however, may be more complex than it seems and may require more than just political will. The interactions between economic, social, and political concerns can prevent energy transitions from taking place. As the scientific community warns of the consequences of climate change, and many countries seek to transition to cleaner, more sustainable sources of energy, it is crucial to understand how energy transitions are best carried out. This is the subject of Cymene Howe's recent book, Ecologics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, where she explores how these competing forces of social, economic, and political concerns impeded the construction of the Mareña Renovables wind park in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca. This park, as Howe writes, would have been the largest of its kind in all Latin America. Last week, I called Cymene Howe to talk about her work on wind power in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Cymene Howe is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rice University and a founding faculty member of the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences. Howe is the author of Intimate Activism, The Struggle for Sexual Rights in Post-Revolutionary Nicaragua, and Ecologics. Her current work focuses on the social life of ice in the Arctic, exploring the social and political dimensions of ice as well as the consequences of its expiration. Here's our conversation. Cymene Howe, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Rice University, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be on the podcast.
I'm really glad to be here with you, Enrique. Thank you for the invitation.
So in the study or studies that give life to your new book, Ecologics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, you focus on energy transitions, how these happen, and what are the things that happen during these transitions, who are the actors that matter. And the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico serves as your case study to try to answer these questions. And more specifically, your work focuses on the Mareña Renovables wind park, which did not end up becoming a reality. So I kind of wanted to start just to introduce your work with these questions. Why did you decide to make Oaxaca your case study? What was so attractive about the Isthmus of Tehuantepec for you as a researcher, as an anthropologist? And can you tell us a bit more about this case specifically of the Mareña Renovables wind park?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons for going to the Isthmus to study energy transitions, on the one hand, was a policy question because a number of favorable policies had been put into place by the former president of Mexico. And he had created a kind of policy regime that made it favorable for private partnerships to work with government bodies in order to create the infrastructure for renewable energy transition, and in this case, the form of wind parks. And what some people know, but many people don't, is that the Isthmus of Tehuantepec has some of the best wind in the world for generating renewable electricity. And so you have this incredible natural resource that pushes its way through the Sierra Madres wind tunnel and creates a force of wind that's formidable, but that can also be harvested. You can harvest this kinetic energy and create incredible resources in terms of renewable energy. So on the one hand, we had Calderón's policy regime. We had interest from international investors to put resources and infrastructure into the isthmus, and this was actively occurring as we began our research project. And then you also have this really incredible resource of the wind that blows across the isthmus. And so for a case study, it made for a kind of perfect set of circumstances, but in some ways paradoxes, because the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is also very famously a place that has had its own political will, if you will. It's been famously known as a place that would sort of refuse to be conquered by the nation state of Mexico that was able to fend off the French in that battle. And it has been a stronghold of indigenous resistance and indigenous politics, and in some ways, socialist-leaning workers and students politics in the region as well, very famously in the 1980s. And so while you have these potentials for generating renewable electricity and placing these apparatuses of energy transition into place, you also have a strong sense of place, a strong sense of sovereignty that people feel over the isthmus land and over the resources that might then be extracted either above that land in the form of wind or in occupying that land with wind turbines, as is the case in the isthmus, where we have terrestrial turbines that are not offshore, they're on land. And so you have a sort of fraught but interesting dynamic that happens between the politics of land and the wealth of the wind. And that's what we were interested in trying to understand and to study in these cases.
So in the book, you write that in collaboration with Dominic Boyer, that you conducted more than 300 interviews. What are some of the kind of actors that you spoke with, and what were you able to glean from these conversations?
Well, Dominic Boyer and I are both cultural anthropologists, which means that we study living populations, and we do, as you see, lots of interviews with people. We do a lot of participant observation as well, going to meetings, government meetings. And we were able to talk to an incredible range of actors, basically a representative or more than one from every sort of interested party or stakeholder that involved in the isthmus wind. So one of our early interviews was with the engineer of development for creating wind parks across the isthmus, and he was in charge of sustainability for the state of Oaxaca. So we were able to get a lot of insider information from him because he had been working in the policy regimes for several years. In 2008, there was a handful of parks in the isthmus, and now we have many, many dozens of parks. We were able to talk to activists on the ground who were resisting the formation of the wind parks, who saw this as a way of expropriating indigenous land. Many activists in the region talked about the advent of these wind parks and the proliferation of these wind parks as what they called La Nueva Conquista, or the new conquest of Mexico. And it had a kind of a sting to it, or an ironic twist, also for the reason that many of the companies that were investing and still are invested in the isthmus are companies from the United States and from Spain. And so you have this feeling of, these sort of imperial powers or colonial powers coming once again to sort of extract resources from indigenous people, from Mexico as a place, from the land, the wealth of people and their territories. So this idea of Nueva Conquista really took off in a lot of different sectors as resonating, right, historically over the last 500 years, and then again in the present. But we were also able to talk to some very interesting figures, a couple of them who did not want to be named. And these were high-level banking officials who worked in the investment wings of major banks, international banks that invest in these projects. We were able to talk with people who work for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank about investments that are being prioritized. The World Bank is prioritizing exclusively investment and development projects that are renewable, sustainable, and transitional in that sense. They're, have made a commitment not to invest in sort of fossil fuels and the kind of negative fuel industry that's gotten us into the situation of climate change that we're currently in. And we were able to talk to a lot of regular folks on the ground, people who live surrounded by wind parks. The town of La Ventosa is a small sort of little village, a suburb of Juchitán, which is the big municipal center in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And in La Ventosa, you have a community that's completely surrounded on every side by wind parks. Like literally the town cannot grow past that belt of wind parks that surround it. So we did the only comprehensive community study that's been done of any community in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And we worked with a team of young researchers from Juchitán, a group of 5 of them, and then the 2 of us. And we went door to door and we knocked on every door in the entire village and collected a couple of thousand different responses to a survey to see how people were feeling about these wind parks. Were they providing jobs? Were they providing a better future? Were there infrastructural changes that people were appreciating? So we were able to get, I think, a very comprehensive picture of both the high-level politics at the level of, speaking with government officials at the federal level in Mexico City, where we also did about 2.5 months of fieldwork speaking with officials, and then the kind of on-the-ground politics among activists in the streets in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and then the kind of whole middle range of people who are involved in the industry, from people who work there, who work in the industry, including Spaniards and Mexican nationals, as well as the people who live in the region and are feeling the impacts, positive and negative, of these developments in the region.
So you also mentioned that there's some other non-human actors that play a role in this energy transitions. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what these are and why it is important that we focus on them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, this is, again, one of the elements I wanted to bring into play, because there has been a sense, at least in many sort of Western imaginaries or the kind of the political imaginary of the liberal settler colonial West, that energy is something that we take from environments, right? Whether it's in the form of wood or coal or oil or what have you. These are all sort of resources to be extracted and to be taken from environments. But we know from basic biology and plant biology and physics that environments are really spaces of energy in and of themselves. And there is an interrelationship, a tightly locked relationship between energy in the form of physical energy and the biotic life that we see around us in the form of plants that are doing photosynthesis, in the form of animals who are consuming those plants and then have their own calories that they create in their flesh that then humans go and eat. So it's all part of a larger energy system, if we think about it in those terms. And so I wanted to try and think more complexly about the way in which environment, we can bracket that, environment and energy come together in a case like in energy transitions. So on the one hand, of course, we want to preserve environments and keep ecosystems as stable as we can, especially because human beings and human activity, primarily by some human beings and some human activity, has already endangered and made precarious many ecological systems. So again, this is global warming, this is pollution, this is habitat destruction. So we already have a precarious situation. We don't want to make that worse as we're moving forward with our energy transitions and setting up these new infrastructures. So I wanted to look at that very carefully. So one of the things that I do in the book is I look at the different ways in which the environmental impact reports get considered, get created. They're a legal requirement in Mexico, of course. But I was curious to see, what sorts of creatures, what sorts of plants, what sorts of spaces were being seen as in need of protection and which were not, and how that might have an impact, and how we can look more complexly at these relationships. So one good example is that sea turtles were very well studied, as was a particular kind of jackrabbit that lived in the area where the Mareña Renovables Park was to be placed. But one of the creatures, or a couple of the creatures that didn't get considered in any of these impact reports, were fish that live in the lagoon and off the coast, and the shrimp that live there as well. These are not endangered species. The jackrabbit is very endangered, and of course the sea turtles are also, several species are in danger of extinction or threatened. So these are very important, biospaces and animals to protect. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, the reason, one could argue, the reason that the Marina Renovables park could not go forward was because of fish and because of shrimp. And the reason is that the park was very, very close to the lagoon. It was set up, most of the turbines were going to be on a large sandbar, the Barra de Santa Teresa. And there was fear among local fisher folk, the fishermen who go out on the water, and the fisherwomen who process the fish, and use that to provide for their families, especially in times when there's not enough work available, when there's precariousness, economic precariousness in the household. You can always count on being able to go out and fish, and you can eat, right? You don't have to depend on wage labor. And so fishing was seen maybe not as the only thing that people did, but it was seen as a kind of a safety net or a backup of subsistence. And so the threat, literally, of these turbines being placed on the Barra and then disrupting the fish, scaring them away, either with vibration. Fisher folk were very concerned about that. They were very concerned about lights. They were very concerned about the construction phase of the park, which was going to take, obviously, several months, over a year. And it was going to tear up the water and the living spaces of the fish and shrimp at that time. So a lot of the resistance to the wind park came, interestingly enough, not because of a threat to endangered animals, but as a threat to endangering the human beings who live in that region and who depend on particular animals like fish and shrimp as a kind of backstop in their own lives and as a safety net for their own families and their own social systems. So what I saw is that sometimes things that get left out of the picture can be very important to being able to fully realize and illustrate what's happening in a situation. And what might not be the obvious place to go for an environmental impact report might in fact end up being a kind of environmental occupant, a creature, a species that ends up being absolutely fundamentally important to whether a project goes forward or not. So it's about moving the lens out further and asking different kinds of questions. And anthropology has always tried to do that, tried to work outside the box in those ways. And so that was the reason I wanted to try and picture that element of what occurs in transition as well.
In the introduction, you have these two scenarios that describe in very different ways the consequences or the outcomes of having this wind park, the Marina Renovables wind park. And I found this narrative was quite powerful as I was reading them. One of them paints this bright future for energy transition and renewable energies and kind of what it would do, what it means kind of in terms of like global climate salvation, which you kind of have this term in the book. And then it ends saying that this kind of was a failure. And then it has this other scenario where it looks very grim, and if we focus on the local communities that live there, right, and the consequences that they would have where this park had been built, and then it says this is a success. So can you talk a little bit more about this kind of trade-offs that you were mentioning that occurred when trying to transition to different kinds of energy that perhaps we don't think about?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. And I'm glad that those two scenarios worked, because in some ways it's a way of boiling it down into the most direct form of looking at the paradoxes or the juxtapositions that we can see in different forms of transition and development. So one of the key arguments of the book is that we need to proceed very quickly with energy transitions out of necessity, because we've gotten ourselves collectively into a situation with what some people are calling the Anthropocene or runaway climate change. And every time the IPCC comes out with another report, it looks more and more bleak. So we are in a situation right now where we need to move very efficiently to transition away from fossil fuels. That's the foundation of the argument in this book. At the same time, we don't want to repeat the same mistakes that we've made with oil extraction, with coal extraction, with all these different petrochemical forms that in some ways have brought a lot of wealth to some parts of the world and to some corporations and to some people, but at the same time have contaminated spaces, have left people sick, and have left people perhaps more impoverished than they might have been. So there's a good way to do transition, and there's a way to do transition that is not so beneficial. And so one of the ideas I want to get across to readers is that it matters how we do transition to these new energy forms, and that we actually have an incredible opportunity. And that is that we have an awareness now of how to create energy infrastructures that can actually be more egalitarian, that can actually be more fair to the people who live near them, to the people who work with them, and to the people who benefit from this energy. So we have a chance in a way that we didn't back in the Industrial Revolution when we were starting off with coal and these different fossil fuel forms. We have a chance now to do it right. And if we look at these dynamics, we can figure out ways to do it better so that it's more in a more inclusive form of energy democracy, a more inclusive form of energy equality in all those ways that I was talking about. And so with a big project like the Mareña Renovables project, Mareña was going to be the biggest single-phase wind park in all of Latin America, a really gigantic project, 400 megawatts, 132 turbines at 3 megawatts each, a really colossal project. And it was going to save quite a lot of carbon dioxide from being spewed into the air. So that's a very positive thing. We can't afford any more greenhouse gases. And yet at the same time, if corporations and governments don't approach transition in the right way, then they're going to face resistance from local communities, and they should. There should be a questioning that occurs as we're going through these transitions. It should be a fair and reasonable questioning, but we need to be accountable to the places where these energy infrastructures are going to be placed. And as we look at new renewable forms where there's wind, where there's sun, where there's hydropower, where there's wave energy, we need to look at the particularities of these places, understand the human populations that live there and their needs and their expectations, but also the kind of environmental and ecological spaces that are being impacted as well. So there's a lot to account for, but it's our responsibility to do it. And from the point of view of anthropology, understanding the social dynamics, the cultural dynamics that come into play, the historical factors that become involved when we make these big, what are called mega projects. These are all things we need to take into account. And so that's why I wanted to draw a really explicit juxtaposition between a way that we can imagine doing it better, doing it well, versus a way that would just repeat the kind of extractive logics and the extractive politics and resource exploitation that we've seen for many hundreds of years across the world, in all honesty. So here's a chance to do it better, and I think we should really embrace that and go forward with a positive attitude about how to do that and how to work with communities more closely and more effectively.
Well, I think that's a great place to end our conversation. Cymene Howe, Professor of Anthropology at Rice University, thank you so much for answering these questions.
Thank you, Enrique.
That was Cymene Howe. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Luisa Huacata, our program manager, and to Tony Payam, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at mexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. I will see you next time.